everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the House of Horrors belonging to Delphine LaLaurie. This case is absolutely nuts. It is pretty graphic, so I will warn you, but I won't go into too much of descriptive detail on what exactly happened to the people involved. If you're watching this on YouTube, you might see my dog Riptide roaming around. If you do, he's just babysitting. But, like I said, this case is pretty graphic. It deals with a lot of physical abuse towards slaves that were owned by LaLaurie, so if that's something that might trigger you or upset you, please proceed with caution. Without further ado, we are going to jump in. Mary Delphine McCarty was born in New Orleans, specifically Spanish Louisiana, on March 19, 1787, where she was one of 5 children. Her father was known as Louis Bartholomew de McCarthy, though he was originally Chevalier de McCarthy. There's a lot of French that I'm probably going to butcher. Delphine's grandfather was also named Bartholomew de McCarthy and was responsible for moving the entire family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730. This occurred during the French colonial period, and for those who suck at geography like I do and don't have a very good working knowledge or understanding of the states before they were the states, Louisiana was not an English colony until approximately 1754. It originally belonged to the French and Spanish, and there was a decent amount of turnover before it settled in the hands of the English. As for Delphine's mother, her name was Marie Jeanne l'Arabe. I probably said that wrong. I am not French. I am very much American. So we're gonna suffer through that. But anywho, she was known as the Widow Lecomte, as her marriage to Louis B. McCarty was her second. Which is kind of funny because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this case. As you will find out shortly, Delphine actually had 3 marriages herself. So I guess it runs in the family. Ultimately, both of Delphine's parents were prominent in the city's European Creole community. And for those who don't know, Creole means, quote, a person of mixed European and black descent, especially in the Caribbean. A descendant of Spanish or other European settlers in the Caribbean or Central or South America, or a white descendant of French settlers in Louisiana and other parts of the southern U.S. There's a second definition, which is a mother tongue formed from the contact of 2 languages through an earlier pidgin stage. That is your dictionary definition that'll pop up with a basic Google, but hopefully that kind of explains what a Creole is, because I learned about that in 6th grade and then immediately forgot about it, so I figured I'd educate myself again on the matter and educate some of you guys. As for Delphine's uncle, Esteban Rodriguez Miro, he was actually the governor of the Spanish-American provinces of Louisiana and Florida during 1785 to 1791. These provinces were also known as the Californias, and they included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, Wyoming, and Colorado. Basically, the Spanish-American provinces consisted of Texas, New Spain, which was North America, Sonora, Sinaloa, and New Mexico, Florida, and then Louisiana, as well as other parts of specified Spanish territory. On top of this, Delphine's cousin, Augustine de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. So, as you can see, Delphine belonged to a very prominent family with a large amount of power and a wide-reaching reputation throughout Louisiana and other parts of the South. So, a very prominent family name that she was born into, and was basically a nepotism baby as far as that wealth and power goes. As for Delphine's childhood, it was tumultuous to say the least. She was only 4 years of age when the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791. Which was something that made slaveholders in the southern United States and the Caribbean very, very scared of resistance and rebellion amongst their slaves, and specifically violent resistance. As someone who doesn't know anything about what the Haitian Revolution is, I actually took a moment to look it up, and I found the following on slaveryandremembrance.org, quote, "Though long ignored by many who study the age of revolution, The Haitian Revolution stands out as the only instance in which enslaved people and free people of color fought and defeated the French, Spanish, and British to end slavery and the slave trade. This successful and complicated campaign for freedom and equality began in 1791 and resulted in the creation of the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, an independent Republic of Haiti, in 1804. End quote. As a result of this unrest, Delphine's uncle was actually killed in 1771 by his slaves during a revolt. And this was part of the revolution that inspired the local Mina conspiracy in 1791. And the Mina conspiracy refers specifically to a 1791 slave uprising which was plotted by enslaved people identified as Mina in Pointe Coupee Parish in Louisiana. This group was basically going to try and overthrow those who were enslaving them and then just try to end slavery as a whole, which wasn't that different from the Haitian Revolution. This was organized by Mina men like Jean-Louis, and the plot was to be executed on July 7th, 1791, but was actually delayed until July 9th due to poor weather, which I think is a little bit funny, where they're like, hey, we really want to end slavery, but it might be raining really hard, so we're going to wait 2 days. I don't know. It seems a little silly in the grand scheme of things. Maybe there was like a tornado or something, or like a hurricane that I don't know about, but it seems a little ridiculous if you think about it that way. I also found it sort of compelling that this occurred pretty close to the 4th of July, which, you know, as we know, is America's birth date, and, like, Viva la Revolution. So I just thought that was a little interesting. Anywho, the conspiracy was ultimately betrayed when an enslaved person named, it's Dique, and I want to say it's just the French version of Dick, but it could also be pronounced Decay, but I'm just going to go with Dick. An enslaved person named Dick confided in another enslaved person, Venus, who then reported the plans to her enslaver. First of all, nobody likes a freaking snitch. Second of all, what the fuck, Venus? You gotta be viva la resistance. Like, help the brothers out, help the sisters out. We gotta end slavery. We don't gotta snitch on each other. I don't know what her reasoning was. Maybe she felt like she was doing the right thing and trying to keep people from, like, dying. But also, viva la resistance. Like, hello, Age of Revolution. However, obviously that didn't end up working out, and ultimately the nearby militia intervened and arrested 17 enslaved men who were then sent to New Orleans for trial, leading to the overall suppression of the revolt. So thank you again, Venus. I'm pretty sure you probably didn't have a lot of friends after that, because that was kind of a shitty thing to do. As for the Pointe Coupee conspiracy in 1795, this was another attempted slave rebellion which took place in Spanish Louisiana, like I said, in 1795. As a result of this attempted rebellion, on May 4th, 1795, 57 enslaved people and 3 local white men were put on trial in what is known as modern-day Pointe Coupee Parish, after, again, the attempted slave conspiracy to basically revolt and end slavery, or at least escape slavery. Overall, the trial ended with 23 of the enslaved people being hanged, their corpses decapitated, and their heads posted along the road like this is freaking medieval times, and like the Vikings are here to raid your town. 31 more were sentenced to flogging and hard labor, which was already being done to them anyways, if we're being honest, so I don't really know how you can call that a punishment when you've basically legalized that type of behavior on a daily basis. Seems very hypocritical, doesn't make a lot of sense, but whatever, slavery didn't make a lot of sense anyways. Thank God it's over for the most part. As for the white revolutionaries, all 3 white men were deported, with 2 sentenced to 6 years labor in Havana. Overall, these uprisings increased the harshness and brutality directed towards slaves. A lot of slaveholders felt that they could basically beat the resistance out of the slaves they owned, which seems incredibly counterintuitive, if you ask me personally, because I think that's just going to piss them off more and make them want to kill you more, but whatever, what do I know? Common sense wasn't very common. Anywho, now that we've gotten that history lesson out of the way, we're going to jump back to Delphine and her crackhead story, because we're just getting started, and this shit's absolutely insane. On June 11th, 1800, at age 13, Delphine married Don Ramon de Lopez y Anguilo, a Caballero de la Real de Carlos, a high-ranking Spanish royal officer at the St. Louis Cathedral, maybe St. Louis, I don't know, in New Orleans. marrying a man of status just like her mother had, and basically ensuring that her family continued to be upper class, or at least in the upper threshold of society. The Louisiana, basically spelled Luisiana, as it was spelled in Spanish, became a Spanish colony in the 1760s. This was after France was defeated in the 7 Years' War, and the 7 Years' War is a story in and of itself. So we're just going to wave at it and move on and say, bye, 7 Years' War, like, thanks for being here, we have other things to talk about. In 1804, after the American acquisition of what was then again a French territory, because remember, at this time, the English, the French, and the Spanish were all fighting over what would eventually become the U.S. Anywho, during this time, Don Ramon was appointed the position of Consul General for Spain in the territory of Orleans, and was called to appear at the royal court in Madrid, which meant, obviously, they're going to have to travel a lot, I think probably in like a big canvas wagon. They didn't have cars back then, so it was a long trip, an arduous trip, very difficult. While en route to Madrid with Delphine, who was pregnant at the time, Don Ramon suddenly died in Havana, which meant that Delphine was 17 years old when this happened. And just a few days after his death, Delphine gave birth to a daughter named Marie Borgia Delphine Lopez y Anguillo de la Candelaria, nicknamed Borquita. And the widowed Delphine and her child ultimately returned to New Orleans. And frankly, this is a lot to deal with at just 17 years old. Like, yes, times were different back then, and you were expected to have a family and have kids and be married by the time that you were 17, but that's still a lot, especially with the traveling and how difficult traveling was back then, let alone the fact that you have like a 2-day-old baby that you're taking with you. Very, very stressful. I don't envy that part of her life at all. In June of 1808, aged around 21 years old, Delphine went on to marry Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator, basically a jack of all trades and a man of status yet again, because remember, her family is prominent, she's got to marry a prominent man. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street for his family, which would later be known as the Villa Blanc, which is not very original, and in my personal opinion, I feel like you could get a little more creative with it. But it is what it is, and it works at the end of the day. At least we all know who the house belongs to. So I guess maybe that was that was the entire point. Anywho, Delphine then had 4 children by Blanc named, and just wait for this, it's going to get confusing, Mary Louise Pauline, Louise Mary Laure, Mary Louise Jean, and Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanc. I don't know how she kept all of her kids straight. And frankly, the creativity here when it comes to naming children legitimately sucks balls. Because everybody's middle name is somebody else's first name. And I think there's 2 kids that also have the same first name. So yeah, there's no way in hell any of this made sense to anyone outside of the family. And I bet you she butchered, like, who she was talking to on more than one occasion. You know how, like, a parent goes down the whole freaking list before they get to the kid that they want? Guarantee you that happened. But, all joking aside, Delphine's eldest daughter, Jean Blanc, would actually die in, actually, I can't remember if it was a son or not. Either way, her eldest child would actually die in 1816, which is very unfortunate. On June 25th, 1825, Delphine married her 3rd and final husband, physician Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie. Every time I say LaLaurie, it makes me think of that meme where it's like, LaLoyd, L-L-O-Y-D. I can't help it. The ADHD in me loves it. So, anywho, she married physician Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, who was actually 15 years her junior. And if I did my math correctly, I think this placed him at about 27 years old, and she would have been like 42 or around that age. I guess he liked cougars, because personally, I would have passed on Delphine, even just based on pictures, let alone the shitty attitude that we will discover that she has. But in 1831, Delphine bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she actually managed in her own name and with very little involvement from her husband. Which, if she didn't end up being an absolutely psychotic person with severe sadistic tendencies, I would actually find this very impressive given the time period. But I don't like her, so I'm going to withhold my compliments and tell her to go kick rocks and stub her toe, and if she were alive today, I would hope that she stepped on a bunch of Legos. However, that is not the case. In 1832, she had a 2-story mansion built there, and was completed when there were slave quarters put in place. And I won't lie. With so much talk about revolution and like Viva la Resistance and freeing slaves, I actually kind of forgot at a certain point that slavery still existed at this time. So in case you forgot, slavery is still very much a thing. She had a 2-story mansion. She specifically built slave quarters. So, another big L for Delphine, because fuck you for having slaves, even if it was part of the time period. And then it only gets worse when you find out what she did to those slaves. Anywho, Delphine lived at the residence with her third husband and then 2 of her daughters, and she maintained a central position in New Orleans society. Remember, her third husband is a physician, so again, she's still married to a man of status, still maintaining that family name and that image and being a socialite. However, the marriage definitely showed signs of strain. In fact, on November 16th, 1832, Delphine actually petitioned the First Judicial District Court for a separation of what's called bed and board of her husband. And she stated that he had treated her in such a manner as to render their living together unsupportable. These claims were actually supported by her son and then 2 of her daughters, all of which were born by her marriage to Jean Blanc. And the separation was put into effect, but it didn't seem like it lasted very long because Dr. LaLaurie was still present at that home when a massive fire would ultimately break out and kind of reveal the house of horrors that Delphine and he were living in. So I think the separation might have been like emotional more than anything, but it definitely didn't stick, or I don't know if they made up or whatever. It gets weird. Stuff was messy back then. Stuff is messy nowadays. You never know what you're going to get. As for the treatment of slaves, accounts of Delphine's treatment of the people she enslaved between 1831 and 1834 definitely vary, but there are some common stories that have persisted throughout time. And while the stories vary, it's very clear that she absolutely did not give a fuck about any of the slaves that were in her care. This lady absolutely sucks. We're going to get into some of the weird shit that ends up happening. Oh, God, I bumped my mic. So just forewarning you, some of the things I will talk about as far as treatment, they are not good. It is very, very dark. So if that's something that's going to upset you, I apologize, but it's something that needs to be talked about. Because this lady is like the female version of Satan. I'm pretty sure he's like one of those weird little babies that he accidentally had with a human, and like she just came out and had horns on her head and a tail and a pitchfork and said, I'm gonna go ruin everybody's life. Because holy shit, we are gonna talk about some crazy ass stuff. Anywho, Harriet Martineau wrote in 1838 and recounted a lot of tales told to her specifically by New Orleans residents during this time period, pertaining to Delphine and what Delphine did to her slaves. Martineau claimed that the enslaved people of LaLaurie were observed to be, quote, singularly haggard and wretched, end quote, when compared to other enslaved individuals. However, at least in public appearances, LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and described as solicitous of the health of those enslaved. And I hate to break it to you, but someone not being racist in public doesn't mean that they aren't still racist. It's like, oh, well, just because I don't say the N-word in front of black people, you could still say it at home. You can still say it in front of your white friends. Like, that doesn't negate the fact that you're a shitty person. So I think it's funny that that's included. Like, oh, well, she was nice in public. Doesn't matter, because as we'll find out, she's an absolute monster behind closed doors. On top of this, Delphine, like I said earlier, is a woman of status and a socialite. So on top of her just like maybe hiding the blatant racism, she knows how to play the part so that people don't look at her in a derogatory way or a skeptical way. Like, she knows how to manipulate people into seeing her in a positive light, so she's not going to be outwardly racist in public. I do have to mention that I find it concerning that even by slavery standards, her treatment of slaves was said to be absolutely abhorrent. Like, in a system that is meant to abuse people of color, you have other individuals who still whip their slaves and beat their slaves going, that's a little too much. Like, that should be concerning. You know that you've done crossed a line. And something that I found was interesting is that there was something called the Black Codes at the time that provided regulations on how slaves should be treated. Now, it wasn't the best of regulations, but it was something, and one clause reads, quote, slaves who shall not be properly fed, clad, and provided for by their masters may give information thereof to the Attorney General or the Superior Council, or to all the other officers of justice of an inferior jurisdiction, and may put the written exposition of their wrongs into their hands, upon which information, and even should the information come from another quarter, the Attorney General shall prosecute said masters. So there's even, like, codes of conduct on how you should treat people that are your slaves. So she very much violated all of this, but I just find it interesting that, like, they had to put a code like this in place. I mean, it makes sense because people suck ass, but it's just an interesting bit of historical context because I didn't know that this was a thing at all. But it makes sense why regulations had to be put in place, probably because people were killing so many of their slaves that, like, I don't know, it just looked bad, or we got somewhat morally better as a society. I'll have to look into more, have to look into why the black codes were made. I didn't look at that up at the time, but I am curious. That said, what's really interesting as well is that despite having, like, the black codes that are, supposed to guide you on how to treat slaves, LaLaurie was also having massive and very, very lavish parties, specifically at her residence, where the guests that were there were being doted on by the slaves that she had. Which means that a lot of people were seeing malnourished and beaten and haggard slaves, but they didn't give a flying fuck about it. Which isn't that surprising, given the time period. I think it's abhorrent. But these were all super wealthy individuals who probably didn't care beyond what they saw with their rose-colored glasses and being invited to this socialite's party. They probably only cared about getting drunk off their asses and, like, you know, talking about money. Another interesting fact is that some sources state that part of Delphine's punishments for her slaves was going through a series of 8 lashes over and over again, and she would do that until the slave was unconscious. So she's a very evil woman, and it only gets worse. According to Martineau, funeral registers between 1830 and 1834 document the deaths of 12 enslaved people at the Royal Street Mansion. However, the cause of death for each of these individuals is not mentioned, which is a little inconvenient, and a little upsetting, but I don't think people kept particularly great records back then, so I'm not too surprised, and to be honest, they probably didn't care enough because it was an enslaved person that died. However, these deaths are said to have included a woman named Bonnie, who was a cook and laundress, and then her 4 children, Juliet, who was 13, Florence, who was 10, Jules, who was 6, and then the youngest being Leontine, who was 2. Which is very, very sad. And also concerning that a mother and her 4 children all, like, respectively died at around the same time. It looks like they all died in 1833. Actually, 2 died in 1831. Everybody else died in 1833. So very, very short time period. Just a little suspicious if you ask me. Anywho, Bonnie had previously been enslaved by a refugee from Saint Domingue and was described during her sale as a, quote, chronic runaway. And I think this overall is very fucking stupid because there was huge revolutions going on in Saint Domingue where people escaped after killing their enslavers and basically saying, hey, we want to end slavery entirely. Then they came to Louisiana and then bought slaves themselves. I don't know how you escape slavery on your own through revolution and then go and enslave your own people. To me, that's absolutely ass backwards. I don't understand how any of that makes sense. And then on top of this, with such an influx of white and free refugees from Saint Domingue, those who were already in Louisiana and New Orleans who had slaves were scared that this ideology of revolution was going to carry over. So I think it's interesting that you have some people that are like, oh no, they're here, they're going to free our slaves, and it's going to be bad. But at the same time, these people who just did a violent revolution against slavery are now buying slaves in this new territory that they're part of. It doesn't make sense to me morally or ethically, but like, it is what it is, I guess. I can't change it. It's just part of history, but I find it very confusing and upsetting. On top of this, court records at the time show that Delphine actually freed 2 captive enslaved people, Jean-Louis in 1819 and De Vince in 1832, which is nice in theory, but it does not absolve her of the freaky shit that she does later. Martineau actually wrote that public rumors about her mistreatment of slaves at the Royal Street residence were sufficiently widespread at this point, so much so that a local lawyer was dispatched to the property to remind Delphine of the laws for the upkeep of enslaved people, aka the Black Codes. So people were like, hey, by the way, remember these laws? Yeah, you still need to abide by those. Like, you can punish your slaves and you can be a little bit of a shitbag to them, but you can't be too much of a shitbag because then you're crossing a line. Like, the fact that other slaveholders had standards and said, hey, she's crossing a line here and not upholding these standards is freaking wild to me. It's crazy, but I'm glad at least somebody called her out, because good God. So it's really interesting, the irony of it. But yeah, to me, that has to be proof enough that she's a particularly fucked up individual. Now, during this visit, the lawyer found no evidence at the time to suggest specific wrongdoing or mistreatment of those enslaved by Delphine. To me, it kind of feels like what happens a lot with modern times, where you're like, hey, DCS, this kid's living in a really shitty situation, and then DCS shows up and doesn't do anything, and you're like, oh, that's weird. Why didn't you do anything? And then other times they're taking kids away from people who don't need to have their kids taken away. I'm not shitting on DCS workers, I'm shitting on the system because I have had way too much experience with it, and my family adopted my brother with the help, air quotes, of DCS and the court system. It's a shit show. I digress. Anywho, Martineau also recounted other tales of Delphine's cruelty that were whispered amongst New Orleans residents throughout 1836, basically saying that one of Delphine's neighbors saw an 8-year-old, some say 12-year-old enslaved girl, fall to her death from the second-story roof of the mansion while trying to avoid punishment from Delphine, who was wielding a whip. And as somebody who was spanked growing up and knows how scary that can be, and your parent hitting you regardless, or in this case, your master, that feels really weird to say, hitting you has to be terrifying. And if I was scared by just being spanked by somebody's hand, I've never been whipped. I can't imagine what that would feel like. But I know that the fear of God was in that poor little girl. And the fact that she had to have been so scared, the idea of jumping off of a roof just to avoid being hit seemed like a safer option than dealing with this freaking psychotic-ass woman chasing her onto a roof with a whip. The girl's body was subsequently buried on mansion grounds, though some sources say that Delphine wanted to hide the child's body because she knew that she fucked up, and then consequently threw the body into a well on the property where it was later found. Jeanne de Lavigne, in her 1945 account, gave the child's age as about 12 years old and gave her a name as Leah or Leia. Nobody really knows, which is sad and very unfortunate. Later, other writers regarding Delphine and her House of Horrors would elaborate on the case, saying that Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, as so often happens, but this pissed Delphine off to the point that she grabbed a whip and started chasing Leah around the mansion, fully intending to cause this poor little girl severe bodily harm. And as we'll find out later with some of the crazy shit that Delphine did, I can only imagine how absolutely scared that this child was. Because holy shit. Like, this woman had no self-control when it came to what she did to people. According to Martineau, this particular incident and the death of Leah led to an investigation of the LaLauries as a whole, in which they were placed on trial and ultimately found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 of the slaves that they had in the household. And while in theory this is a step in the right direction, we have to refrain from celebrating because Delphine is a fucking flaming asshole of the highest degree, because these 9 slaves were ultimately bought back by Delphine through an intermediary relative. And then these slaves ultimately had to go and live back at the mansion. So basically Delphine was like, hey, I'm having my slaves taken away. They're going to be up for auction again. I need you to buy them and then give them to me. And her shitbag of a relative was like, yeah, sure, I'll help you with that. And then that's what happened. So literally none of these abused individuals were helped in the slightest. And they were, property again because they'd been bought. The government can't intervene anymore. They were put back into the situation in abusive household that they were already in. And if I'm reading the room correctly, they probably faced even worse abuse having been returned than they did while being there originally. So a very, very shitty situation. And around this time, one of Delphine's neighbors, a well-intentioned man, sent over his own lawyer to investigate the abuse that was taking place, or at least the rumored abuse. The lawyer was a young Creole who stated that Delphine was appalled at, quote, anyone who would suspect her of the slightest unkindness to the humblest of living thing, end quote. I shouldn't have to say it, but this is very clearly manipulative behavior and a way to change the narrative surrounding herself because, again, she's a socialite. She wants people to think of her to the highest degree. And so, oh, well, I would never hurt us. Oh, God, why would I do that? What I see happening here, in my mother's words, is thou dost protest too much. It's no different than somebody who's committed a brutal murder insisting that they would never hurt a fly. Oh, I wouldn't do that. I would never hurt a fly. Like, I'm a Christian. Just throwing things out there that are intended to make them seem like a good person, but honestly just piss me off in the long run because, like, I know that you're using it as a tool to deflect what people are accusing you of and to seem like you are better than you actually are. So, obviously, she doesn't see anything wrong with what she's doing, and she really doesn't give a shit, and she's gonna give people lip service just to get people off her back. On top of this, Martineau would actually go on to recount a story, which is particularly horrific, and that is that Delphine kept her cook, who's about 70 years old, starved and chained to the kitchen stove, beating the cook, and then beating Delphine's own daughters when they tried to feed the cook or other enslaved individuals. This right here has to be some of the most sadistic shit that I have ever heard. Like, let me have you cook food for this household, but I'm going to starve you while you have to cook this food. That, to me, the psychological torture of that alone. This whole thing is so sadistic. And speaking of sadism, I do want to take a moment to discuss sadism as a whole. Sadism, in layman's terms, is the enjoyment of pain and suffering on other people. You can enjoy it either by causing it directly or not causing it but still taking pleasure in it. And then sometimes there's sexual sadism, but I don't necessarily think that's the case for Delphine. That's very common in men and not as much women. Is it possible? Yes, but it's just statistically not the same, if that makes any sense. More than anything, I think that Delphine really just enjoys torturing people mentally, physically, and emotionally. I mean, take the cook, for example. That is some of the most fucked up shit I've ever heard. There's literally no other reason for her to chain her cook to the stove, make her prepare meals, all while starving her, other than the sake of enjoyment and getting some sort of pleasure out of it. Sadists are characterized as people without empathy, remorse, or guilt, traits that are similar to those who have psychopathy or sociopathic tendencies. They often seek positions of power that allow them to exert harmful things on those beneath them to get that type of pleasure and get that type of joy. They will ultimately shame and humiliate people as well as just outright torture them. And there is a theory that 4 types of sadism exist. And the American psychologist responsible for this theory is Theodore Millon, who argues that there's spineless sadism, tyrannical sadism, enforcing sadism, and explosive sadism. So I'm going to take a second to read what this article says and just break it down and explain what I think Delphine fits. Spineless sadism is consistent with sadists who lack courage and are overall insecure. They exploit those who are weaker than they are, which consequently bolsters their self-esteem and just gives them this boost of self-confidence and sense of worth that they otherwise don't have. Then there's tyrannical sadism, and tyrannical sadists seek and deploy power, which they use to abuse others. They are destructive and unmerciful to those who they abuse. They do it just because they can and they have the power to. Then we have enforcing sadism. Enforcing sadists enjoy punishing those they believe deserve it, whether because they have broken the law or a social code or some perceived type of standing or rule in society. Enforcing sadists may look for rules of authority in society through which they can inflict such punishment, whether that's, law enforcement. Hell, you could even do it as like a football player or whatever. You get to beat people up on the field. You can get kind of creative with it. Then you have explosive sadism. Explosive sadists are highly reactive. This is basically dependent on their own anger management issues. So when their temper boils over, they then blow up and seek to inflict pain as a source of vengeance. This can kind of be compatible with like a lot of domestic violence issues, and specifically repeat offenders within domestic violence issues. Now, personally, I'm inclined to believe that Delphine falls under a more tyrannical role than anything else. To me, Delphine functions in a sociopathic way, fueled by her sadism and the power dynamic between herself and the slaves that she has, which she uses to inflict disproportionate amounts of pain and suffering. People with sadistic tendencies and sociopathic traits are incredibly manipulative, and I can see Delphine using the fact that slavery exists as an excuse to do whatever the fuck she wants to her slaves, under the guise of social standing. She's also able to weaponize her wealth and her social standing to basically get whatever she wants. It's no different than like people of a wealthy status committing some of the most heinous crimes and not getting any sort of punishment for it. Let's not forget Caitlyn Jenner did vehicular manslaughter and got a slap on the wrist for it. Why? Because they are wealthy, they have the money, they can do whatever the fuck they want. I also think that it's important to discuss the power dynamic between Delphine and her husband, because up until this point, I haven't really talked about him. But in situations where both parties of a marriage are perpetrators of abuse and crime, and specifically through sadism, there's typically someone who fits a more dominant role and somebody who fits a more submissive role. You cannot have two dominant personalities in situations like this. It doesn't work. Somebody has to be subservient to the other. Typically, this is like the dominant role is fulfilled by a man, typically. But many accounts frame Delphine as the one who, quote, wore the pants in the family, just overall, and then consequently was the dominant role when it came to the sadism and torture and abuse that took place. Keep in mind, Delphine was severely independent, and it's likely that this type of behavior emasculated her husband, who is also, I think, 15 years, I mentioned, younger than her, and she was used to this lifestyle long before he was. So there's a lot of power dynamic issues here. So it's not unlikely that her husband was fulfilling a subordinate role while Delphine was taking that dominant position. Like I said, this would not only emasculate him, given the time period, but it would also make it increasingly difficult for him to do anything about the abuse and sadism that was taking place, even if he wanted to. Because at the end of the day, no one's going to believe him given the caste system and socioeconomic roles prominent at the time. They're going to say, well, it's your wife, you're the man, you're in charge. Why are you having these problems? Like, put her in line, get her to do this, when that is not the way that the power dynamic has been laid out. Overall, due to the abuse that Delphine's cook faced, on April 10th, 1834, a fire broke out in the Royal Street mansion, beginning in the kitchen. When police and fire marshals reached the residence, they found the 70-year-old cook chained to the stove by her ankle, as rumor had said. Now, the cook later said that she had actually set the fire as a suicide attempt because she feared being punished, stating that slaves taken to the uppermost room, the attic, they never came back, which we can all assume what happens with that. Let's not forget that 12 bodies were reportedly found on the property, so it wouldn't be surprising that Delphine killed quite a few and then just buried them in her backyard. And while this is terrifying in and of itself, I have to say I'm a little confused as to why the cook thought it would be, like, appropriate to burn the house down and not realize that she was going to try and basically kill everybody else and herself. But also, I wasn't in her shoes, and I can't imagine how desperate she was and scared shitless of what was going to happen to her given Delphine's pathology. I mean, essentially, it was only a matter of time before the cook was probably killed. So, I can't fault her for that. I just think it's interesting. Because also, we have to keep in mind that, like Delphine chased an 8 to 12-year-old child onto a roof with a whip and watched this kid jump off out of fear. Like, this 70-year-old cook doesn't stand a chance. Delphine's going to do with her whatever she wants to do with her. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11th, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure that everyone had been evacuated, not just the white people. And to this I say, we love good bystanders. This part actually made me pretty happy because I think it would be easy back then to just say, oh, well, whatever, they're slaves, have fun burning. But they actually cared enough to try and save everybody, including the slaves, not just the white people. Now, at this time, while bystanders, fire marshals, and officers were trying to get into the quarters and get everybody out, the LaLauries said, fuck you guys, we're not giving you the keys. To which the bystanders said, no, fuck you guys, we don't even need the keys, and then just broke down the doors to the slave quarters and the residence and the attic. And they actually found 7 people more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. This is a quote that was in the New Orleans Bee. These slaves claim to have been imprisoned there for some months. Now, I personally can't imagine stumbling into this, because here you are trying to be a good person, a good Samaritan, and make sure that nobody's in there burning to death. And then in the process of doing something scary but also heroic, you find slaves basically being crucified in this woman's home while it's on fire. This has to be the scariest scene ever. If horror movies existed back then, this would be a scene in a horror movie for that time period. Like, I can almost guarantee it. It's just, it rings all the bells of just body horror, just scary shit. Now, one of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-Francois Canongi, who subsequently deposed to having found in the LaLaurie mansion, among other things, a, quote, I apologize for the language, negress wearing an iron collar, and, quote, an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, who was too weak to be able to walk, end quote. The judge said that when he questioned LaLaurie's husband about those specific enslaved people on the property, he was consequently told in a very insolent manner that, quote, some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business, end quote. To which I say, that's a baby back bitch response. Fuck you. So not only do I hate Delphine, I also hate her little baby bitch ass of a husband, because this guy sucks. To his comment, I say, dude, like, you cannot excuse crucifying your slaves because you're mad somebody went into your house to try and save them while your house was on fire. You can't point the finger and be like, well, if you never came to my house, this wouldn't be a problem. Bro, your house was on fire and people were trying to help you. Like, I'm sorry that the circumstances ended the way that they did, but I'm glad that they did, because you are also a flaming asshole. You are, like, literally the human epitome of diarrhea. You and your wife suck. So, shut up. You made me mad. When I read that comment, I wanted to bitch slap him, like, through time and the layers of space and sound and whatever the fuck. I just wanted to strangle his ass, because what an insolent thing to say. What a stupid thing to say. Anywho, a version of this story circulated in about 1836 and recounted itself in Martineau's writings, and she added that the enslaved people were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. Ultimately, investigators of the fire found 7 slaves in total being kept in the attic and in this particularly horrendous, nefarious state. What particularly disturbs me about all of this is the pronged collars, because that's what dogs wear. Dogs wear pronged collars to aid in obedience and correcting behavior. So Delphine has not only abused these poor people, but essentially degraded them to the level of an animal, and then tortured them too. On top of this, accounts state that of the 7 slaves kept in the attic, an elderly man had his face so beaten it was undistinguishable, unrecognizable. And there was one woman who had her back wounded to the point where her bones were visible. Just, like, I don't even know how to explain this in a way that does it justice, but in order to get to the bone, that is so intentional, so vicious, so violent. It's completely and totally unacceptable, and the fact that it even happened in the first place is fucking horrific. And again, Delphine, I hate you. I hope you're rotting in hell. I hope that the devil uses you as a freaking toothpick for his teeth, because you deserve it, you piece of shit. I can't imagine what any of those poor people had to deal with, and I can't imagine the type of pain that they endured throughout this whole thing. Because honestly, there is no other purpose to this type of torture and abuse than sadism. If you think about it critically, in most cases, although wrong, people would beat slaves as a form of punishment for perceived behavioral problems or poor work for performance. But overall, they kept them well enough to work and perform their given tasks, because that's what they want slaves for. They want slaves to perform. If they went around beating the shit out of their slaves so that they couldn't function, there'd be no fucking point in having them. But Delphine did not stop at what would be perceived as a basic punishment and like behavioral correction. She took it beyond that. She tortured her slaves out of commission, so they literally couldn't do the jobs that they wanted to do. Not that they wanted to do, that she wanted them to do. So what would be the point of doing this if you require their services? The only goal for this type of torture is fulfilling a sick, twisted, perverted type of pleasure. And to make matters worse, some rumors say that Delphine even used her husband's doctoral tools for the torture she inflicted on the slaves. So that's also not great. I will say, however, that while Delphine sucked ass, her daughters were a lot kinder. In fact, her daughters actually kind of put a smile on my face with this. Sources say that while Delphine tried to get her daughters to hate slaves the way that she did, and even partake in the abuse and torture that was happening, her daughters were far more sympathetic to the household slaves, and just the slaves in general, and actually attempted to feed them, particularly the ones they saw as malnourished compared to everybody else. Unfortunately, Delphine then responded with a lot of punishment for her own children to basically beat the kindness out of them. And anytime she found them feeding a slave or being kind to a slave, she punished them. So this woman didn't just abuse the slaves in her household, she also abused her children too. Literally nobody in that household was safe from her and her sadistic tendencies. Like, she lived to hurt people regardless of what her relationship was to those individuals. So yeah, she sucks. I hate her so much. Anywho, when the discovery of the abused and enslaved people became widely known, and this part I'm so super happy about, a mob of local citizens actually attacked the Royal Street mansion and, quote, demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands on, end quote. I will say, I'm not usually a fan of vigilante justice, but in this case, I fully support it and I appreciate it, because if anybody deserves to have their house destroyed by a mob, it's this lady, because she fucking sucks. And honestly, you know you fucked up when, like, other slaveholders say you're a piece of shit and your house deserves to be burned to the ground. Like, you've crossed a serious line at that point, and the irony kills me, and I think it's a little bit funny. Now, a sheriff and officers were called to disperse the crowd, because they have to do their job, and obviously there's a crime being committed. But by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with, quote, scarcely anything remaining but the walls, end quote. Delphine's slaves were then taken to a local jail where they were available for public viewing. And this is the point where I feel like every time we take a step forward, we take 2 steps back, because to me this is really gross. Putting their suffering on display like some kind of freak show really rubs me the wrong way. And the way it was justified is that they wanted people to come and see what had been done to these slaves. And at the end of the day, up to I think about 4,000 people had attended the viewing. It feels really weird to say, of the slaves to, quote, convince themselves of their sufferings, end quote. Now, I understand we as humans have this grotesque type of curiosity, but I also feel like this was made a spectacle out of the horrible beating and torture that was inflicted on black people. And I don't feel like it was really appropriate to put that type of pain and abuse on display for a bunch of white people to view. It feels like torture porn. So I am not a fan of what they did here. However, I do think it aided to a certain extent in the documentation of what was done to these poor slaves. So, again, 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. Now, the Pittsfield Sun, citing the New Orleans Advertiser and writing several weeks after the evacuation of Delphine's quarters of her victims, claimed that 2 of the enslaved people found in the mansion ended up dying following their rescue, which honestly isn't that surprising given the circumstances that they were found in. But at the very least, there was an end to their suffering, and they didn't have to stick around and deal with being pawned off to another slaveholder, because I can't imagine the amount of trauma that was inflicted on them. It's absolutely insane. Absolutely nuts. The article also added, quote, we understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found, end quote. These claims were repeated in by Martineau in her 1838 book Retrospective Western Travel, where she placed the number of unearthed bodies at 2, including the aforementioned child Leah. Others, like I said, placed the bodies at about 12. So it could be anywhere from 2 to 12. It is what it is, but investigators did their due diligence and dug up the grounds of the mansion to try and see, what was going on here outside of what had been told, and if there were more stories and deaths that had taken place than what they knew about. Now, LaLaurie's life after the fire in 1834 is not particularly documented. Martineau wrote that in 1838, Delphine fled New Orleans during the mob violence because she's a coward. And this was around the time that she ended up taking a coach, which, if you don't know, is like a wagon and horses, to the waterfront, and then ultimately traveled by schooner to Mobile, Alabama, and then from there to Paris. And by the time Martineau personally visited the Royal Street Mansion in 1836, it was still unoccupied and horribly damaged with, quote, gaping windows and empty walls, end quote. At this point, we're going to get into the life and, the after effects of Delphine and then her death. There's not a lot here to go off of, so I will warn you, there's not, a whole lot of information. Now, while Delphine was living in exile in Paris, and rightfully so, because fuck her, she avidly campaigned to go back to New Orleans amongst her family, but was ultimately dismayed by her kids, basically because her kids were like, hey, if you go back there, you're probably going to be murdered, and, you're going to cause way more, problems, given the fact that you absolutely tortured and abused people, and killed quite a few of them. So, she did not end up returning. She listened to her kids, I guess, and made that decision. As for the circumstances of Delphine's eventual death, they're very unclear. Nobody really knows what happens. In 1888, George Washington Cable recounted a popular but very unsubstantiated story that Delphine was actually killed in France due to a boar hunting accident, which seems a little unhinged given the circumstances and the fact that she was a socialite. I don't know how or why she would have gone boar hunting, but I guess it's a plausible theory. It just seems a little ridiculous in my opinion. Now, in the late 1930s, Eugene Bax, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 until 1924, actually discovered an old copper plate in Alley 4. It was damaged, it was cracked, but this was in the cemetery, and the inscription of the plate read, it's in a bunch of French, so I'm just going to read the English version. Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris December 7th, 1842, at the age of 6, and then blank. Now, according to the French Archives of Paris, LaLaurie actually died on December 7th, 1849, and not 1842, which would have placed her at the age of 62. Interestingly enough, the mansion, though no longer in its original state, it's definitely been reconstructed and revamped and sold and changed quite a few hands, is a tourist hotspot for, one, the history, but also a lot of people claim that it's haunted. And I personally don't believe in ghosts, but if any place is going to be haunted, I can see why this hellhole would be haunted. I can see why ghosts would be mad and have a lot of negative energy here. So that's the House of Horrors when it comes to Delphine LaLaurie. Again, not a great human being, very much a sadist, very much somebody with sociopathic tendencies, and like I said, I think she falls under the tyrannical sadism category more than anything. Overall, a very shitty human being who enjoyed the torture of people who were already oppressed enough and did not need to be abused the way that they were. Yeah, I never knew about her. I didn't know she was that big of a piece of shit, but now you know too. So we can both be angry at her together and hope that she's getting her comeuppance down in the flaming pits of hell. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to rate and review. I apologize if you're watching this on YouTube. I've been freaking itching my nose this whole time. I don't know why. All of a sudden, the allergies have started to kick in, but I apologize. I didn't have any allergy pills, and it literally just started happening while I was recording. If you're listening to this, the only reason you know about that is because I snitched on myself, so don't say anything to anybody else. Anywho, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay psyched out.